Good evening, and you're all very welcome to our JCT CSP webinar. Our webinar tonight is on using radio as a resource in the CSPE classroom, a case study on the topic of refugees and human rights. My name is Sarah Camellan. I'm a teacher in Maryfield College in Drumcondra in Dublin. I teach CSPE, English and Politics and Society, and I've been an associate with the JCT for CSPE for the last year. And joining me tonight is my colleague Marion Roach.
Hi, as Sarah mentioned, my name is Marion Roach. I am a teacher in Castletroy College in Limerick. I'm a teacher of English, Geography and CSP, and I'm also a qualified guidance counsellor. And like Sarah, this is my first year working with JCT as a part-time associate.
So just in terms of some housekeeping for the webinar tonight, some important information before we get going. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a handout, which we would invite you to download at this point, as we will be referring to the handout and various links listed on the handout throughout the course of the webinar this evening. We'd also like to invite you to please share any questions or comments you have with us at any point throughout the webinar. You can type any questions or comments you might have on the right-hand side of your screen, and our team will get to as many questions as possible throughout the night. So without further ado, we'll just get started.
We are going to use an RTE DAC1 documentary as a case study for this webinar. These images are of Anas and Ammar al-Khalji, two Syrian brothers. There are also images of scenes of rescue vessels, Italian volunteers who provided food to migrants, and people seeking asylum who were stuck in Milano Central train station in 2014. I now invite you to take part in a pre-listening activity. Put yourself in the shoes of one of your students. Take a few minutes to look at each photograph and come up with a possible title for this documentary. Submit your title using the questions function, which you will find at the right-hand side of your screen.
So there's some great suggestions for titles coming in there. Thank you so much for your participation. And I'm sure you can imagine how your students might respond to some of these images and the various types of responses that you may get from a class. So we've had some comments there about some of the images being quite tough and difficult to look at. Absolutely, and we'll come to that later on.
Not all radio documentaries will have a web page with images. While images can act as a useful visual cue when asking learners to come up with a title, an adaptation might be to write the title on the board and ask your students what they think this documentary might be about, or create a word association worksheet to help them carry out this task. The name of this documentary that we're going to use as our case study tonight is Sand, Sea and Smugglers. At the end of a set of activities related to this, or indeed another radio documentary, students could be asked to revise their title on the basis of what they have heard and learned. These are our learning intentions for the next 50 minutes or so. Recognise the benefits of using radio in relation to the CSPE short course. Some of you may previously have used a radio documentary in English, but radio has a particular relevance for CSPE, and we will explore this idea. Participate in pre, during, and post-listening activities specific to learning outcomes in Strand 1, Rights and Responsibilities. Insofar as is possible in the time that we have for the webinar, we will invite you to join in activities which can be linked to Strand 1, Rights and Responsibilities Learning Outcomes. Elsewhere, we will outline some possible methodologies and would welcome your feedback and suggestions via the question function, again, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. Explore generic methodologies for use with radio documentaries. Many of the methodologies and student worksheets in this webinar can be used alongside documentaries other than the Sand, Sea and Smugglers radio documentary. Identify existing quality radio sources and resources. We will finish the webinar this evening by highlighting where other radio documentaries can be sourced for CSPE, and by also flagging some teaching and learning resources that will help you to introduce radio into your CSPE class.
Thanks, Marion. So as you know, the focus of this webinar is on Strand 1, Rights and Responsibilities. So we wanted to start with where to access the CSPE Short Course Specification from 2016. All formal education curriculum specifications are located on curriculumonline.ie. If you click on the Junior Cycle tab along the green border towards the top of the page, then on Short Courses in the drop-down menu, then on CSP, you'll be brought to the Short Course page. You can access the PDF of the specification by clicking on the image on the various sections of the specification by clicking on the Curriculum Specification button. You can also find a link to this in the handout accompanying this webinar that we refer to at the start of the webinar, and it's also available on the right-hand side of your screen now. So as you know, this webinar tonight is focusing on using radio in the CSPE classroom. For those of you who are interested in the history science aspect of radio, you may know about Marconi, an Italian inventor who is credited by many as the inventor of radio. He sent and received his first radio signal in Italy in 1895, and by 1899, Marconi flashed the first wireless signal across the English Channel. 2 years later, he claimed to have had received the letter S, telegrammed from England to Newfoundland. On the 13th of February 1946, just after the end of World War II, the United Nations established a radio broadcast. More recently, the 13th of February was established as World Radio Day. And each year, the United Nations announces an annual theme for World Radio Day. For example, last year, the theme was radio and sport, which had a focus on challenging gender stereotypes in sport. This year, 2019, the theme is dialogue, tolerance, and peace. On the screen, you'll see a quote from Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, where he talks about the global reach of radio as a media platform that reaches the most people in our world. And I'm sure just reading that quotation now, you might think how that would be a useful quotation or prompt for discussion in your own classrooms. So specifically in relation to the CSPE context, radio has the potential to bring us stories and case studies from near and far into our own classrooms. And this gives students the opportunity to listen to stories, a wide variety of stories, some that mirror their own experiences and some from a totally new perspective. This supports our students to make connections in their own communities, locally, nationally, and indeed at a global level. So we're going to look now at the rationale as outlined in the CSP short course specification, and you can see it now on your screens. The stories and case studies that students hear in radio documentaries can help them to question, critique, and evaluate what is happening in the world. Radio documentaries could be from a local radio source about a local story in their community, for example, or could equally be about issues facing people and places further away, as our case study tonight does. These stories have the potential to move students from an internal and individual focus on well-being to thinking about the well-being of others and of our planet, and help them to understand that individual well-being is very much connected to and dependent on collective and ecological well-being. And as CSPE teachers working as part of well-being, we know that this is something we're very, very interested in. Using radio documentary then really facilitates opportunities for students to build key skills. The learning activities highlighted on this slide, as you'll see highlighted in green, are in play regardless of the topic of the radio documentary used. Other key skills, such as, for example, listening, expressing myself, will also be activated, even though these are not referenced in this specification. In addition, further key skill elements may be activated depending on the topic and associated methodologies you use in the classroom. So tonight we're looking at one particular case study, but of course the idea would be that you take these methodologies and perhaps use other radio documentaries in the classroom. In that case, other skills may be activated.
Thank you, Sorcha. Now we will return to our Strand 1, Rights and Responsibilities Related Radio Documentary, titled Sand, Sea and Smugglers, and we will complete a post-listening activity. As you can see on the slide, each radio documentary in the RTE Radio 1 Online archive is housed on its own webpage and includes a blurb and introductory information. A post-listening activity might be to ask students to work in pairs or small groups to produce a blurb for the documentary they have been listening to. The vocab grab activity you see on the screen has a literacy focus. It involves pre-listening consideration of key words or terms that are included in the radio documentary. Students are asked to write definitions for each word before listening, firstly on their own, editing in pairs, and then agreeing a class definition. As they listen, students are encouraged to add new words or phrases they think were important in the blank rows at the bottom of the table, thereby embedding inclusion into the activity. After listening to the whole radio documentary, students again work together as a class group to finalise definitions for all key words and phrases, including those added by students as they listened. This interrogation of key words and phrases is a really important part of listening to any radio documentary. In reference to the Sand, Sea and Smugglers, key words like asylum seeker and refugee are often used interchangeably. And it is very important that students understand the differences between these two words when they are listening, and also using these words correctly when talking about the issues that they raise. I now invite you to spend a couple of minutes to read through the asylum seeker and refugee definition.
And again, with CSPE, it's so important that we just have these definitions and this evidence-based and factual, because sometimes I think these terms, I'm not sure if you, Marion, but my students certainly often confuse these terms, and as I said, they're often used interchangeably. So it's just important that the students really have a sense of clarity around these terms.
Absolutely, I totally agree, Sorcha. So as we move on now to the next methodology, it is a pre and post listening activity. The true, false, unsure activity on the screen is a before and after listening activity, and one which you may find particularly useful. Each of the 10 statements on the slide are derived from information that students will hear in the Sand, Sea and Smugglers radio documentary. Before listening, students read the statements and respond to each by ticking the true, false or unsure in the before section on or the left-hand side of the table. Take a few minutes to read through the statements and jot down your responses to each, i.e., is the statement true, false, or are you unsure?
And again, with this activity, Marion, one thing that we had thought was, depending on your particular group of students or your own school context, these statements could be indeed very, very challenging for students, and they may actually be unsure about all of them. But I think in one of our discussions, we said that that's, I suppose, part of the learning, really, that even just reading that information and processing how much of that information they may process will really help them in listening to the clips or listening to the documentary and give them a sense of some of the information that they might encounter throughout the documentary. So even if they aren't sure, we still think there's some really valuable learning in this activity.
Absolutely, there's a conversation to be had around that area with your class. So in case you have any learners who would be struggling with some of the terms or wouldn't be familiar with the topic, that it would be a good opportunity to address that in a class-wide discussion. After listening to the entire documentary, students read the statements again and respond to each by ticking true, false, or unsure in the after section. This is on the right-hand side of the table. Statement 1 is false. According to the United Nations, 250,000 Syrians were killed and 12 million people displaced from their homes between 2012 and 2015. Statement 4 is false. 3,000 people lost their lives trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea in 2014. Statement 9 is also false. In Ireland, 8 months is a very short time to be waiting to get refugee status. All other statements are true. Once your students have the correct answers, it would be useful to use guiding or prompt questions to help students reflect on the task. For example, how many statements did you alter? So, i.e., how many statements had a different answer after than before? What statement surprised you most? Did you learn anything about common misconceptions or stereotypes from this activity?
We just have a couple of comments coming in there around some teachers finding it challenging if you have students from refugee or asylum-seeking backgrounds in the class, and certainly that's something we acknowledge. We will actually point you to a really useful resource in how you might manage that in your own classroom later on in the webinar, so thanks for your comment there.
SANS, Sea and Smugglers is one of a number of radio documentaries funded by Irish Aid, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, that have potential relevance to the CSPE strands 1 and 2 learning outcomes. As you may have noticed from information in the statements in the true, false and untrue activity, the documentary, which was first aired on RTE Radio 1 in 2015, the data is now not up to date. A focus on up-to-date data from reputable sources is an important aspect of the CSPE short course. Having engaged with the radio content, students could be encouraged to access and interpret the most up-to-date information. A useful starting point would be the UNHCR website. For your own information, the latest information April 2018 available from UNHCR is that 5.6 million people have fled Syria since 2011, and 6.6 million are internally displaced. Syrians represent the largest number of people applying for a refugee status worldwide. The scale of the Syrian conflict and the resultant movement of people is also relevant to the direct provision system in Ireland. In 2017, more people from Syria claimed asylum in the Republic than any other nationality, and figures available for 2018 indicate that Syrians still rank amongst the top 3 nationalities looking for refugee status.
Thank you, Marion. So at this point, we're very aware that we're talking about a documentary that you haven't actually heard. So we're going to play you 2 clips from the documentary throughout the webinar tonight, and the next activity involves you listening to one of those clips. So we want you to listen to a clip from SANS, Sea and Smugglers, the radio documentary from the Doc on One that we're referring to. And in this clip, Anas Al-Qadri describes life in Damascus before and after the outbreak of war in Syria. While you are listening to the clip, we ask you to consider Anas's life in Damascus before and after the war.
I'm from Damascus. I like my old life. The Champions League on the TV with the guys. There is a coffee shop and we used to play card there and see the matches. And after the coffee shop we go to dinner. And the dinner was 2 or 3 in the morning. All of this changed now. There's no electric, there's no water, there's no anything. There's nothing there.
This is the sound of the almost carnival atmosphere of the Arab Spring reaching the Syrian city of Hama in July 2011, when thousands of citizens gathered in the streets singing "Come on Bashar, it's time to go," demanding the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad. What followed has been a brutal suppression and a complex civil war involving rebel groups and jihadists, creating a humanitarian disaster in the country.
Dissent in Syria is being met with an increasingly harsh response from the government.
UN investigators say they have a high degree of confidence that chlorine has been used repeatedly and systematically as a weapon in the Syrian Arab Republic.
According to the UN, 250,000 people have been killed and 12 million displaced from their homes. For Anas and Ammar, life as they knew it was ripped apart. The family had had a factory that was destroyed in fighting. Life shrank as they were confined to small parts of the city.
The last 4 years, you can't do anything. I'm just going back from my work, eating my lunch, go see some friends in just a small area. There's no safe place.
Finding themselves in the hands of these people was in large part down to the fact that in Syria, military service is compulsory for all males over the age of 18. Anas managed to defer it as he went to college, and he has a degree in civil engineering. But after he finished that, he was wanted by the military.
If any soldier captures you and you are run from the military service, they will take you to the prison. It's really small. They will capture you and torture there. You can't stay in safety without doing anything. You will carry a gun and shoot, that's for sure.
Anas was stopped by a soldier on the road.
I was in the car and he asked for my ID and he asked me, "Where's your military book?" And I told him, "I'm sorry, I forgot it in my home." He opened the door and take me out and slapped me in front of like 200, 300 person on this. And actually I can't look at his eye, because if I do anything he will shoot me. And even when I go back to my home, I told my father and he just told me, "Okay, don't go out your home. This is the best way." And in this time I think about it's time to get out and to start a life. After 4 years there's no new work or new anything, just blood and bombs everywhere.
And so Anas decided it was time to leave the country that he had lived in for the first 24 years of his life.
Okay, so that was our first clip from the documentary that we're going to hear tonight. What I'd like to do at this point is invite you, if you didn't download the handout at the start of the webinar, on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the handout. So if you just go into the handout and you'll see the first link is for Padlet. So if you could click on this link and it will open for you. Some of you may be familiar with using Padlet in your own classroom, so we're going to use Padlet now as part of our webinar this evening. And if you're seeing the Padlet on your screen now, what we'd ask you to do is fill in any detail about Anas's life in Damascus before the war in the circle on the left-hand side of the Venn diagram. Write detail about life in Damascus after the war on the right-hand side, and place the things that might have remained unchanged in the middle of the Venn diagram, where the two circles overlap. And just in case you're having any issues, just make sure that you double click on the screen to comment, and then you should be able to drag your text box anywhere on the screen. So just double click on the screen and you should be able to add a comment. Some really interesting comments coming in there. And interesting to see that there's some coming into the middle. And as always with these kinds of activities, we're trying to think of our own response as teachers, but also the response that our students might have to this kind of activity. How might they find this? What would their response be to this? And I think even some of the terms coming in there, we can really see the emotional impact of this clip. I see someone's written there, existing, not living, afraid, dangerous, lost everything. Some really emotive terms. And then some really interesting terms on the other side in his life before the war also. And perhaps this is something our students may not always consider. Have our students ever considered what someone like Anas's life may have been like before the war? Some great words coming in there also. Enjoyable, fun, normal, typical, safe, happy.
And again, depending on your school's policy on the use of ICT, this slide could be downloaded as a potential worksheet that students could complete together in pairs.
Great, thank you so much for your participation in that activity, and hopefully you can see how that could be a really useful activity to use in your own classroom, depending on how you wish to adapt it. So in terms of your own classroom, you may wish to invite students to take notes as they listen to the clip and then work in pairs to populate their Venn diagram, and then perhaps do a think, pair, share. There's lots of different ways that you could potentially adapt an activity such as that. A possible extension activity or homework task would be to ask students to listen to the entire documentary, thereby flipping your classroom and adding anything additional they may hear to their Venn diagram. So the two Al-Qadri brothers made the Mediterranean crossing from Libya to Italy separately and had quite different experiences. In this activity, students would listen to a clip from Sand Sea and Smugglers, where Anas describes his experience on the boat from Zuwara in Libya across the Mediterranean Sea to Italy. During this experience, the boat's pump fails and the water begins to enter the boat. As they listen, students would be invited to note the most important things they hear, and they would do that on the left-hand side. Now, we're conscious that you have heard all of the documentary, so think about how you might use an activity like this with another documentary. As with all radio clips, depending on your particular group and/or the activity, you may need to play the clip a second or a third time. Once your students have listened enough times, they could perhaps pair up, compare their notes, and write down any additional points their partner heard that they did not. And they might do that on the right-hand side. So a really good opportunity there for collaboration in the classroom. Based on their notes then, each student could create a picture of a scene from radio, labeling each part of their drawing as appropriate. Students could then pair up, as they had done before, to compare their drawings and help each other to make additions, or in fact they could orally take turns to present their drawing to the whole class. And we think this is a particularly useful and good activity because it asks students to transfer information from one communication mode to another. Some people, as we know, some of our students will be visual, while other students respond better to aural stimuli like sounds and music. Getting them to transfer from one mode to another requires focus and can lead to deeper learning. And as with the activities we're showing tonight, this activity is obviously transferable to radio documentaries other than the one we are focusing on tonight. As CSPE teachers, whether you're using the 1996 syllabus or the 2016 short course specification, I'm sure we're all familiar with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 30 articles of which are summarised on your screen. We would like to draw now on your own expertise and ask you how you would use the Sand, Sea and Smugglers radio documentary to build your students' understanding of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. If we were to lift a roof off your classroom, what would be happening in terms of student engagement with the documentary and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? So we invite you at this point, if you have any ideas or thoughts, could you share them with us now through the question feature on the right-hand side of your screen. How would you use this documentary to build your students' understanding of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights? And I'm sure we're familiar with this, and I'm sure we use it in lots of different ways in our classroom, but thinking specifically about this documentary, we'd love to hear some of your ideas. And this is also something you might do with your own students, asking them if they can see a link between the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and the documentary that they're listening to. Or alternatively, equally, we could also ask them to think about the Sustainable Development Goals. Is there a link between the documentary that they're listening to and engaging with and any of the Sustainable Development Goals? Great, so there's lots of interesting ideas coming in, and we might get some of those if we have time at the end, but thank you so much for your ideas. And I think it's really important to acknowledge at this point that you are the expert in your own classroom. You really know how what you're doing and what works best with your students, so thanks so much for that. We will take all of these ideas on board when we are producing the Sand, Sea and Smugglers Teaching and Learning Resource, which, as we said at the start of this documentary, will be sent to every one of you when it's completed. So here's a little UDHR, Sand, Sea and Smugglers activity that we came up with earlier. Before listening to the documentary, students could be asked to work in small groups to write down 5 UDHR rights that they think might be respected and 5 rights that might be violated or denied for people who flee their homes because of conflict or war. Once they have listened to the entire documentary, students could then be asked to pick one of the rights they had anticipated as being respected and one right they had anticipated as being violated or denied, and write an explanation of how this actually occurred in the story of the Al-Qadri's brothers' experience. So once again, a really real-life example from a documentary of how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights plays out in real life.
We will now move on to a methodology that can be used while listening to a documentary. The 2 methodologies referenced on this slide are very adaptable for use with all radio documentaries. Stop, think and ask is where after a short clip, you pause and allow students a moment's reflection without writing. Then ask them to write a question based on the clip they have just heard, and then to pose to a classmate. An example of a part of the documentary that could be used as a clip before asking students to stop, think and ask is the first quote on the slide. After 5 nights, I decide to leave this camp, whatever I do. I just start walking, walking, walking. I have no clothes. All my clothes were covered in oil and my smell was really stink. So I'm really shy to walk the streets. I just start walking and I find a pub. No one speaks English there. I will now model the next methodology. Stop, think and share. Stop, think and share is where you tell students they are going to listen to a short clip. And as they listen, they should consider, how does what they hear make them feel? What does the clip make them think? What else would they like to know? Do they connect to anything in particular that they heard in the clip? I am now going to play the clip for you.
I know that I will complete my study and I will pay my tax like every Irish person. And I wish a good life here.
Amar is doing his FETAC exams, also in civil engineering, and also hopes to go to university.
We are not here to take the jobs from the European people, from the Irish people, or make problems or ISIS things. ISIS is like cancer, really. It's easy to make friends in Ireland. Lovely people, so it's easy. Yeah, you just need to say hi.
About Ireland, it's peaceful here. And for our experience, not the money, not the work, not anything important than safe place to live. I'm not afraid from anything here, because I can say whatever you say, and this is our freedom.
After playing the clip, you pause and ask students to jot down their immediate responses to the extract. When students have written their responses, ask them to share their responses with their partner. You can ask some pairs of students to share their responses with the class. Depending on your class, you might find it useful to employ this methodology multiple times during a specific radio documentary. The next slide is an end of lesson reflection activity. Reflection on learning is a very important aspect of CSPE. Reflection is not just about how students feel about an issue or a topic, but it can also be a way of helping them summarize what they have learned, to help them make connections to existing knowledge and experiences, and also to challenge themselves to think and feel differently. It is important to vary the method of reflection so that it doesn't become a tick box or meaningless activity. This worksheet can be used in a number of ways. Firstly, you could distribute one copy to each student and ask them to complete it at the end of the lesson. This could also be a homework task. Or you could distribute just one copy and ask 6 students, chosen randomly, to complete one of the questions. Used in this way, the sheet could be a useful way of summarizing learning from the lesson in your next class. This worksheet also acts as an assessment for learning methodology because it provides a snapshot of what the students learned during each lesson, what they found most interesting and engaging, and any outstanding questions that they have. On the screen, you can now see a post-listening assessment task. We are moving now to talking about assessment of learning, or summative assessment. Our assessment idea, linked to San Seeing Smugglers radio documentary, is now on the screen. It's the end of 2018. 3 years have passed since the story of Anas and Amar's journey to Ireland aired as a radio documentary. Imagine you've been asked to do a short follow-up documentary with the two brothers. What questions would you ask? You will need to make sure that students understand the difference between closed and open-ended questions, because this is, as you can see in the bubble on the slide, included as one of a possible success criteria for this task. You can co-create or co-construct additional success criteria with your students. Information related to the status of the two brothers will be available in the final resource. On this slide, we have pulled together 2 additional assessment tasks with possible success criteria that could be used at the end of engagement with the documentary itself. The first, P.S. I Love You Survival Guide, is in reference to the fact that one of the very few things that the Al-Khalgiri brothers knew about Ireland in advance of arriving here was the movie P.S. I Love You. The second assessment task, Documentary Pitch, is inspired by the fact that RTE Doc and One team work with people with no radio experience to make their first documentary. They mentor all their documentaries, i.e., one of the team works directly with the documentary maker in formulating an idea into a radio documentary, helping them with interviewing, recording, editing, and structuring the documentary. They are always looking to present old and new stories in a new way. And so in this assessment task, students have the opportunity to pitch an idea for a radio documentary about a human rights issue of concern to them. Getting students to come up with their own pitch for a radio documentary is moving them from being consumers of media to being producers of media. As CSP teachers, you may see action possibilities with one or both of these assessment ideas. Students will complete at least 3 citizenship actions as part of their learning across the 3 strands of CSPE short course. Students create an action record for one of these as their classroom-based assessment. Although the length to the action record or CBA is potentially here, it would be dependent on whether, as a class group or in small groups, the students decide that this action is of genuine interest and concern to them.
Thank you, Marion. So between October and November 2018, over 800 CSPE teachers took part in the first JCT CSPE CPD Day. And I'm sure hopefully maybe some of you attended one of those days. Everyone who attended was asked to complete a survey about implementation of CSP in their school and the types of supports they needed for CSP. 504 teachers completed the survey, which was a joint initiative between JCT and DCU's Institute of Education. Question 13 of the survey looked like this and asked respondents to rank the aspects of the CSPE short course that they would like more support on. 43.7% of the respondents said that engaging with Strand 1, rights and responsibilities, learning outcomes, was the most important support. This research finding was the basis then of our thinking when we came to formulate this webinar, because of the clear human rights and responsibilities element in the Sand, Sea and Smugglers radio documentary. So you will now see on your screen Strand 1, Rights and Responsibilities from the 2016 short course specification. And just a reminder that that's also available in the link in your handout on the right-hand side of your screen. So on your own at home, we would invite you to read through Strand 1 on your screen. Read through the learning outcomes and identify which learning outcomes your students would encounter if they took part in the activities we have outlined tonight in this webinar. So we'll just give you a moment to read through the learning outcomes on your screen. Which of these learning outcomes are most relevant to the activities we have outlined for you tonight? Great, so you'll see then circled in a green, you'll see some of the outcomes that we thought were most relevant. The activities outlined tonight touch on aspects of these 6 learning outcomes, albeit with different degrees of depth. It's really important to note at this point that the webinar activities would not be sufficient to say that these learning outcomes had all been achieved. And in any case, this would not be in keeping with the global nature of the CSP learning outcomes, meaning that students should have multiple opportunities across the 3 years of junior cycle to engage with skills, content, and values and attitude suggested by each learning outcome. So we've focused quite specifically on the case study of this documentary tonight, but our hope would be that you would consider using radio in general and various sources of radio in your CSP classroom. So here are some of the considerations that may be important to think about before, during, and after using radio documentaries in your CSP classroom. Just take a moment to read through some of them. And of course, depending on your own context, some of them may jump out to you as something may be more relevant to you than others. So for example, depending on the resources and the facilities in your school, you may need to download the entire documentary so you can play it offline. You may need to think carefully about the equipment that you will need. Do you need speakers? Do you have them? What about a phone or a laptop? Some of you may already employ the flipped classroom approach, where depending on your class, you might ask students to listen to the entire documentary before the class, so that you can then focus on the most relevant clips with structured tasks to ensure active listening during the class. So again, that's another option. Now I'd ask you to draw your attention to the during, after considerations. And this is when we speak to some of the comments we had came in earlier. And it's really important during and after the documentary that we are cognizant of the prior experience of our students. So for example, in the case of Sand, Sea and Smugglers, you might want to be thinking of your students in terms of their conflict, war, migration, refugee or homelessness experiences. These are all issues which they may be personally affected by and issues that are raised in the documentary. As we know with lots of CSPE topics, these themes generate the possibility for controversy. And this controversy may even just be in terms of conflicting attitudes and opinions about the topic within your own class. So a good resource to deal with this, which is freely available online, in terms of methodologies for dealing with controversial issues, is Tackling Controversial Issues in the Citizenship Classroom. And this is part of the handout, which is once again available on the right-hand side of your screen. It's also available on developmenteducation.ie in the resource catalogue. So now we're going to take some time to look at sources and resources. RTE Doc on One is a huge online archive of radio documentaries with stories and case studies. And the JCT English team has worked on the Doc on One in producing a number of classroom resources, two of which are relevant to the CSPE learning outcomes, and you can see those on your screen. InfoLady, which is relevant to Strand 2 learning outcomes, and GLELIS, which is relevant to Strand 1 learning outcomes. These two resources and others that are more specifically relevant to Junior Cycle English are available on the JCT English webpage. Another resource that is freely available was produced by Doc on One, an NGO called A Partnership with Africa. This resource is based on a radio documentary about two 14-year-old girls living in a direct provision centre and can be downloaded using the QR reader on your phone. So you'll see that QR code on your screen now. The JCT team for CSPE is currently working on the resource to go with Sand, Sea and Smugglers, as we have mentioned, and this will be emailed to you once it has been published. We didn't want to leave the sources and resources section without mentioning podcasts. So you might have your own list of podcasts that you use, and this list the list on the screen may be useful in terms of your own CPD and could also prove useful in terms of sourcing clips for use in your classroom.
Before we sign off, we would like to just revisit our learning intentions for this evening. To recognise the benefits of using radio in relation to the CSP short course. To participate in pre, during and post-listening activities specific to learning outcomes in Strand 1, rights and responsibilities. Explore generic methodologies for use with radio documentaries, and identify existing quality radio sources and resources.
So thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope that if you haven't already considered using radio documentaries in your CSP classroom, that this webinar has opened up that possibility for you. Tonight, we have taken you through activities linked to Strand 1, rights and responsibilities, and also covered some methodologies that can be adapted for other radio documentaries or audio clips. Hopefully now you have a better sense of the sources for radio documentaries and podcasts, and also some of the free classroom resources that are available online. So without further ado, on behalf of the entire JCT CSPE team, myself and Marion, we would like to thank you sincerely for your participation tonight. If you need any further support at any time, have any questions, or would like to give us some feedback, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thanks once again, and a very good night.